was just last weekend from this time that the Jewish people observed Tisha B'Av. And that's the time when they mourn the destruction of the temple, the first and second temple, which has been recorded that it could have been at the same time. And we're going to see the first time Israel did not heed the warnings of the Lord about worshiping other gods. And we look at what happened was they had to be purged from idolatry. By the time they were carried away into captivity, they had their fill of false gods, and they only wanted the true and living God to follow him and to worship him. And Israel had been given a warning from Moses. There was the blessings and the cursing from Moses. And you read it in Deuteronomy chapter 28, the life would hang in balance before you and fear day and night. And when you would say in the morning, oh, if it was evening, even if it was morning, and be carried away by ships to Egypt, by the which you would never go, and being sold as to the enemies as male and female slaves. And we have to see, in the Brit Chadashah, Shaul said that do not to be deceived, that God is not mocked, that what a man sows he shall not also reap. And what it should be is really saying is that you don't mock God and get away with it. You don't thumb your nose. There's, two ways, people living. In the following verse after that, it says about sowing to the flesh and reaping corruption or destruction. And then if you sow to the Spirit, you reap life everlasting. I think some people would, they turn to righteousness and they realize the difference between living for self and living for God. And Israel, we read from after the death of Joshua, many times, go to the book of Judges and going in and out of idolatry, following into idolatry, repenting, and when the judges gain victory over the enemies and then they fall back, called a vicious circle, going from one end to the other. And in First Samuel, it's going back and forth, asking for a king. King David, it's a time of righteousness, and then it was King Solomon. He's falling into pagan women and idolatry. The kings, Israel and Judah separate, and Israel just turns to idolatry instead of following the true and living God, not to go and worship in Jerusalem, which became just the capital of Judah. Eventually, God had enough of it. He says, it was a time like to one prophet says, though, he says, even Job and Daniel and Noah prayed, I would listen to them, but not for the others. And eventually we read that at the end of 2 Kings and at the end of Jeremiah, that the temple, Nebuchadnezzar comes into Jerusalem and destroys the temple and burns it. The city is burnt down, and Judah is taken into captivity into Babylon for 70 years, and to give the land rest, which they had done the sabbatical years. And there was a prophesied, Solomon said, they would look by, people say, this house which exalted, and everybody would pass by it, and they say, why has the Lord done this to this house? And they said, because they had forsaken the Lord God of their fathers, and who had brought them out of the land of Egypt, embraced other gods, and they had to be purged of idolatry. Because many years later, it would happen, Yeshua would come, and he wouldn't want to be, he wanted people to be focused on God, which they were. They were focused on the God of Israel, and still there was a time they had been restored to the land for many years, to their home, and now there was a division. The people came and gladly followed him, and the religious leaders were taking a different stand. They didn't see the prophecy. Now, I've read the prophets, the Nevi'im, to really understand how it would be that Messiah would come. I learned how Messianic prophecy was interpreted by the leaders at the time of the Roman conquest, and they said that he would come as a son of David and be a conqueror, and then come as a son of Joseph and die in battle. And when I've read it, it stands to reason because of sin, and that was from the first Messianic prophecy, that the seed of the woman, the virgin-born Messiah, would bruise the head of the serpent would bruise his heel, that Messiah has to come first to deal with sin, rather than to come and conquer, which he does at the end of the Brit Hadashah, comes back in his second coming. So it's not two Messiahs, but one Messiah who is only the son of David and not the son of Joseph. And he comes first and is put to death for the sins of man. And here was Yeshua looked at him and he says, if only you had known the day of your visitation, that you would have known. And he says, but now your house is left to you desolate. And you think about, it's in somewhere in Psalm 34, it says, they that hate the righteous shall be desolate. And righteousness was in their presence. And they did not recognize him. They did not recognize him as the Messiah. And therefore, after 40 years, when the Israelites rebelled against the Roman Empire, Titus came down with his armies, and again, the temple was destroyed and burned. The prophecy was Yeshua's followers were saying, look at all these buildings here. And he says, you see all these buildings? And he said, not one stone will be left upon another. And we see it if we travel to Israel. I've been there in Jerusalem twice, and I've seen all the Western Wall. Is what remains of the temple today. And I just read this for myself. I wasn't brainwashed. I believe that it was because they didn't recognize Yeshua as Messiah, that the land was left desolate. And here it was, he promised, he said, you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, you know that desolation is near. And he said, let those in Judea flee to the mountains. And all of the believers had fled Jerusalem on that day of 70 AD, called it the days of vengeance. And he prophesied, he said, they shall fall by the edge of the sword, be led away captive, and all nations of Jerusalem will be trampled by Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles